10 minutes after I learned that my sister had inherited my father's house, his investment accounts, his controlling interest in Whitmore Property Group, and almost everything else he'd spent 40 years building. Maris followed me into the hallway and asked about an envelope. Not whether I was okay, not whether I wanted to talk about the $35,000 Dad had left me while handing her an estate worth millions. She caught up beside the elevator, lowered her voice, and said, "Dad didn't give you an ivory envelope, did he?" I stopped with my finger over the call button. There was something wrong with the question, though it took me a second to understand why. 3 weeks before my father died, during the last private conversation we'd had, he'd mentioned an ivory envelope. He hadn't told me what was inside it. He hadn't even told me where it was. And I had never repeated that conversation to anyone. "What envelope?" I asked. Maris watched my face carefully. She was 39, 5 years older than me, and she'd always been better at hiding impatience than fear. That morning, she wasn't doing a very good job of hiding either. Nothing. Just some papers Dad couldn't find toward the end. She glanced toward the closed conference room door behind us. "I thought maybe he gave them to you." "Why would he give them to me?" "I don't know, Elara. He was organizing things." Then she made the mistake that kept me from walking away. "Was there a number on it?" I looked directly at her. "What number?" Her expression changed for half a second. Not enough that anyone else would have noticed, but I'd spent most of my professional life studying old buildings for tiny signs that something underneath the surface had shifted. A hairline crack, a door suddenly sticking, paint separating where moisture had gotten behind it. Maris's face did exactly that. "I don't remember," she said. "Maybe I'm confusing it with something else." Our Aunt Celeste came through the conference room door before I could ask another question. She carried her purse against her chest and looked exhausted. "Please," she said when she saw us, "not today. Your father hasn't even been buried 24 hours and you're already standing in a hallway talking about paperwork." "Maris brought it up," I said. Celeste looked at my sister, then at me. "Your father made his decisions. Neither of you is going to make this easier by turning everything into a fight about money." I almost laughed. I hadn't fought about anything. During the reading, I'd sat quietly while the executor listed asset after asset beside Maris's name. Dad's house on Bellwether Lane, his brokerage accounts, his 72% interest in Whitmore Property Group, his vintage furniture, even the lake cabin where he'd taught both of us to fish. My section had taken less than a minute. $35,000, a box of personal belongings, his old drafting pencil set, that was it. I'd signed the acknowledgement, thanked the executor, picked up the cardboard box, and headed for the elevator. Maris was the one chasing me. "Forget I asked," she said now. She pressed the elevator button herself, as if ending the conversation were her decision. Celeste still wouldn't quite look at me. That bothered me almost as much as Maris's question. I went home with Dad's box on the passenger seat and spent the entire drive telling myself not to invent a mystery just because the will hurt. Maris had stayed close to Dad. I hadn't. She'd helped with his bills, his properties, and everything that became harder for him in the last few years. I lived almost 3 hours away and built a career as a historic preservation consultant, which Dad had once described as finding expensive ways to keep old buildings standing. Maybe the will was exactly what it looked like. Maybe Maris had earned his trust and I hadn't. By 9 that evening, the box was still sitting unopened on my kitchen table. I finally cut through the tape. Inside were ordinary things: 2 watches that weren't worth much, a fountain pen, photographs, a worn leather notebook with most of the useful pages removed, and the wooden drafting case I'd seen on his desk since I was a kid. No ivory envelope. I almost felt relieved. Then I opened the drafting case. 6 mechanical pencils sat in their velvet grooves, lined up by thickness the way Dad always kept them. Underneath them was a white index card. 3 words had been written in his blocky handwriting: Whitmore Row, 17. I read it twice. I'd never heard the name. I opened my laptop and searched property records. Whitmore Row turned out to be a connected group of addresses on the east side of the city, 17 small houses occupying most of one block. What caught my attention wasn't their value. It was the owner listed beneath every address. Not Whitmore Property Group, not my father, not Maris. Whitmore Community Stewardship LLC. I clicked deeper. The entity had been created 11 weeks before Dad died. I sat back and stared at the screen. Maris had just inherited almost everything my father owned. So why had the first thing she wanted from me been an envelope connected to the one piece of his life that apparently wasn't hers? Whitmore Row looked nothing like something my father would have bothered hiding. I got there a little after 9 the next morning, expecting a gated development, or maybe a row of investment properties waiting to be flipped. Instead, I found 17 modest houses lining both sides of a narrow street, most of them built between the 1920s and 1940s. The roofs were different ages, the porches didn't match. One house had pale green siding, another had brick-painted cream, and a third had original wood windows that had been repaired instead of replaced. That was the first thing that caught my attention. Someone had spent real money preserving details that would have been cheaper to tear out. I parked across from house number 6 and walked slowly down the block. On number 9, the porch columns had been repaired with matching old growth wood. Number 12 still had its original transom windows. At number 14, the brick had been repointed with lime mortar instead of the hard modern mix most contractors used. Those were not decisions made by somebody squeezing every dollar from rental property. Those were decisions made by somebody willing to spend more now so the buildings would still be standing decades later. Which made no sense to me, because my father had spent years calling my work sentimental. "You must be Elara." I turned. A woman in her early 60s stood outside a small office wedged between two of the houses. She wore jeans, a navy cardigan, and reading glasses hanging from a cord around her neck. "Have we met?" I asked. "No." She gave me a careful smile. "I'm Nora Bell. I manage these properties for your father." "For how long?" 12 years. That stopped me. Dad had owned 17 houses for at least 12 years, and somehow I'd never heard the woman's name who ran them. Nora unlocked the office and held the door open. "I wondered when you'd come." "Why?" She looked confused by the question. "Because your father said you would." I stayed standing near the doorway. "When?" "A few times toward the end." Nora seemed to notice something in my face and softened her tone. "He didn't tell me what he expected you to do. He just said if you came asking about Whitmore Row, I should show you the records and answer what I could." I glanced around the office. It was small and plain, with metal filing cabinets, a battered desk, a bulletin board covered in maintenance schedules, and a shelf of labeled binders. Nothing about it felt secretive. "Did he talk about my sister?" I asked. Nora's mouth tightened slightly. Maris knew about the properties. Did she know about the stewardship company? Before Nora could answer, a dark SUV pulled up outside. I knew the car before the driver's door opened. Maris stepped out wearing the same camel coat she'd worn to the will reading. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked annoyed that I'd gotten there before whatever she planned to do. "Lara." She closed the car door and walked toward us. "What are you doing here?" "You first." I came to talk to Nora. About the envelope. Her eyes flicked to Nora. "Can we not do this in front of tenants?" "There aren't any tenants here." Nora folded her arms. "And this is my office." Maris exhaled through her nose. "Fine. I just don't want Elara getting confused about what belongs to the company." Nora's expression changed. "Whitmore Row doesn't belong to Whitmore Property Group anymore." Maris looked at her sharply. "The transfer wasn't finished. It was recorded. The election wasn't." I didn't understand the distinction, but Maris clearly did. I stepped between them slightly. "What election?" Maris looked at me, and I saw the same calculation I'd seen outside the estate office. Dad was moving paperwork around near the end. He wasn't well. There were drafts. Nora shook her head. He was very specific about the transfer. You managed rents and repairs, Nora. You weren't his attorney. Neither were you. For the first time in years, I saw Maris lose control of a conversation without raising her voice. She turned to me instead. This isn't your problem. Then why did you follow me yesterday asking about an envelope? Her jaw tightened. Because Dad left loose ends. This looks like a pretty big loose end. I gestured toward the street. 17 houses. Maris glanced down the block, and something in her expression wasn't greed, it was urgency. She stepped closer so only I could hear. Whatever Dad told you, don't sign anything until I see it. I looked at her. Who said anyone asked me to sign something? She froze. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Then she reached for the car door. Just don't do anything stupid. She got inside and drove away. I stood there watching the SUV disappear at the end of the street. Nora came up beside me but didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Maris had just warned me not to sign a document I hadn't known existed. And for the first time, the question wasn't whether Dad had hidden something from me. It was whether Maris already knew exactly what that missing piece was supposed to do. The first thing Nora showed me wasn't a deed, a contract, or anything that looked important enough to make Maris nervous. It was a grey metal box filled with 17 handwritten index cards. Each card had a house number at the top and notes in my father's handwriting underneath. Number 3 needed its porch steps rebuilt before winter. Number 7 had a water heater scheduled for replacement. Number 11 included a reminder that the tenant, Mrs. Alvarez, had lived there since 2009 and that her rent was not to be raised beyond a small annual adjustment. There were repair dates, names, phone numbers, and little promises that had nothing to do with maximizing the value of the properties. On the card for number 14, Dad had written, Robert retires next spring. No sale discussion until after that. I looked at Nora. He did this for every house. Mostly. She pointed toward the last slot in the box. It was empty. A small label underneath read 17. Where's that card? There never was one. Not that I saw. I thought about the index card in Dad's drafting case. Whitmore Row. 17. Whatever 17 meant, it apparently wasn't just the number of houses. Nora pulled a binder from the bottom drawer and opened it on the desk. This is the transfer paperwork I mentioned. The documents were dry enough that under normal circumstances, I would have skimmed them. This time I read every page. 11 weeks before Dad died, ownership of all 17 houses had been transferred from Whitmore Property Group into Whitmore Community Stewardship LLC. The company Maris had inherited no longer owned them. But when I reached the management section, there was no name where I expected one. Instead, it said steward election pending. So who runs it? I asked. Day to day, I do. For now. Who can sell it? That's the question your father never answered for me. Nora turned to a photocopied page near the back. There was handwriting along the bottom margin. 4 words, followed by Dad's initials. Edu must choose. Not inherit, choose. I stared at it longer than I needed to. My initials. He could have just named me. Apparently he didn't want to. That's reassuring. Nora gave me a look that told me she wasn't going to defend a dead man just because he'd employed her. I appreciated that. Your father wasn't always easy to understand, she said. No, he liked making people work for information. Maybe. But I don't think this was about making you work for it. Then what was it about? She hesitated. I don't know enough to answer that honestly. That was the moment I started trusting Nora. Everyone else seemed to have a version of Dad they wanted me to accept. Nora was willing to say she didn't know. I spent another hour going through records. What bothered me most was how familiar some of Dad's decisions felt. He had repaired original windows instead of replacing them with vinyl. He'd rejected a proposal to cover old brick with synthetic siding. He'd paid to reinforce 2 porches rather than demolish them. Years earlier, I'd argued with him over exactly those kinds of choices. Dad had thought my preservation work was impractical. At least, that was what I'd believed. Looking at Whitmore Row, I couldn't tell whether he'd changed his mind or whether he'd been listening to me all along without ever saying so. I left Nora's office with more questions than I'd arrived with and drove straight to Aunt Celeste's house. She opened the door, saw the binder under my arm, and sighed. "You've been to the row. You knew I would go." I suspected. Maris knew about it. Nora knew Dad expected me. You knew something. Apparently, I'm the only person in the family who missed the meeting. Celeste stepped aside and let me in. Her kitchen still smelled faintly of the coffee she'd made that morning. I put the copied transfer document on the table and pointed to Dad's handwritten note. "What am I supposed to choose?" "I can't answer that." "Can't or won't?" "Both." I laughed once, without humor. "That's becoming a family tradition." Celeste sat across from me. "Before you decide Maris stole something from you, you need to remember what the last several years actually looked like." I didn't answer. "She was here, Elara. When your father needed someone at a doctor's appointment, she went. When a tenant called at midnight, she answered. When his taxes became too much for him, she handled them. You were 3 hours away. I know where I lived. I'm not blaming you, you had a career and a life. But Maris gave up things too. That landed harder than I wanted it to, because it was true. Maris and I had spent years reducing each other to convenient versions. She was the daughter who stayed because she wanted Dad's approval. I was the daughter who left because I couldn't stand living inside his expectations. Reality had probably been less clean for both of us. Dad told her she'd handle things someday, Celeste continued, more than once. She had reasons to believe he trusted her with the properties. Then why move these 17 houses out of the company? Celeste's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. He changed his mind about some things. 11 weeks before he died. She nodded. Why? That's something you need to understand in the right order. I was getting tired of other people deciding what order I was allowed to know my own father's intentions in. What does 17 mean? I asked. Celeste went completely still. That was enough of an answer to tell me she knew. There's an envelope, I said. Maris knows about it. Dad left me a card that says Whitmore Row, 17. And this says I have to choose something. Where is the envelope? Celeste looked toward the window. I made your father a promise. Did that promise involve keeping me confused after he died? She didn't respond. Finally she said, Your father changed his mind very late, Elara, about Maris, about you, about what he thought each of you should be responsible for. And you're still not going to tell me why? Not yet. I left before frustration turned into an argument that wouldn't get me anywhere back home. I put Dad's wooden drafting case on the kitchen table again. If he'd wanted me to find Whitmore Row, the card had done its job. But the note in the transfer papers said I had to choose, and Maris had somehow known there was something I could sign. I removed the pencils one at a time. When I pressed my thumb against the velvet lining, one corner lifted. Underneath was a thin cardboard backing that didn't sit flush with the wood. I pulled it free. A small brass key dropped onto my table. It wasn't labeled. It didn't need to be. By then, there was only one place Dad had deliberately pointed me toward, and I knew exactly where I was going next. The brass key fit the narrow drawer at the bottom of Nora's oldest filing cabinet. I tried it the next morning while she stood beside me with her arms folded, looking almost as curious as I was. For one ridiculous second, I expected the ivory envelope to be sitting inside. Instead, the drawer contained a single folded sheet of paper. Dad had written one sentence across it. Celeste has the letters. Elara has the choice. I read it twice, then handed it to Nora. Did you know about this? No. Apparently everybody got one piece of the scavenger hunt except me. Nora handed the note back. Maybe that was the point. I looked at her. That's not making me feel better. It wasn't meant to. 20 minutes later, I was back at Celeste's house. This time I didn't bring the binder or ask permission to sit down. I put Dad's note on her kitchen counter. I'm done doing this in the order everyone else thinks is appropriate. Celeste read the sentence and closed her eyes briefly. You found the key. Dad made sure I would. Only if you went looking. That's supposed to make this better? No. She pulled out a chair. Sit down. I'd rather have the envelope. Celeste studied me for a moment, then walked into the hallway. When she returned, she was carrying a flat document box. She placed it on the table and lifted the lid. Inside was an ivory envelope, larger and thicker than I'd imagined. There was no name on the front, just the number 17 written in Dad's handwriting. I reached for it, but Celeste kept one hand on the box. Your father gave this to me 6 weeks before he died. He told me not to give it to Maris. Clearly. He also told me not to give it to you just because he was gone. That made me pull my hand back. What? You had to find Whitmore Row yourself. You had to ask questions. If you never did, I was supposed to wait until the election period ended and destroy these letters unopened. I stared at her. So this was a test. I don't think that's how he saw it. Of course he didn't. He wasn't the one being tested. Celeste released the box. I'm not defending how he handled this, Elara. Your father had a habit of waiting until he'd solved something in his own head before realizing nobody else knew what he was thinking. That sounded enough like him that some of my anger lost its target. I sat down and opened the envelope. There were 17 smaller envelopes inside, each sealed separately. 16 had street numbers written across them. The 17th had no house number visible from where I was sitting. Beneath them was a packet of documents clipped together. The first page read T stewardship election. My name appeared in the first paragraph. I read faster. Then I went back and started again, 'cause what I was seeing wasn't what I'd expected. Dad hadn't left me Whitmore Row. I wasn't being given 17 houses. I wasn't being handed a secret share of his fortune that somehow made the will reading irrelevant. I was being offered a job. More accurately, I was being offered 10 years of responsibility. If I accepted the position of steward, Whitmore Row could not be sold for 10 years. Annual rent increases were capped by a formula tied to operating costs. A maintenance reserve had to be funded before any distribution could be made. Major renovations had to preserve the existing residential use, and my compensation was fixed at an amount that was comfortable but nowhere close to what someone could make by selling the land. This is what Maris is afraid of, I asked. Celeste didn't answer immediately. Partly. I flipped through the remaining pages. There's no windfall here. I can't even sell the properties. That's the idea. Dad left her millions and left me 17 roofs to replace. Celeste almost smiled, then apparently decided it would be unwise. You don't have to accept. She pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. Participation was voluntary. I had a limited election period, but nothing required me to sign. I sat back. For the last 2 days, some part of me had been building a story I hadn't wanted to admit I was building. Dad had secretly corrected the will. He'd realized he'd been unfair. The envelope would contain something that proved Maris hadn't really won after all. Instead, he'd left me restrictions, maintenance budgets, and responsibility for people I'd met only once. It felt so much like him that I wanted to laugh. Or throw the packet across Celeste's kitchen. Why me? I asked. Why not just put Nora in charge? I think one of those letters explains that. Which one? I don't know. He sealed them before he brought them here. I looked again at the 17 envelopes, but didn't open them yet. One question had become more urgent. Why does Maris care? She has the company. She has Dad's house. She has the investment accounts. If I sign this, I don't take any of that from her. Celeste sat opposite me. No. Then why did she ask about this envelope before she asked me anything else? Celeste looked down at her hands. Because she knew your father had changed the structure of Whitmore Row. Ho. He told her enough to make her angry. That still doesn't explain why she's panicking. Celeste was quiet long enough that I knew we had reached another piece of information she'd been trying not to give me. There was a development proposal last year, she finally said. Maris was involved. What kind of development? I don't know all the details. What do you know? Your father didn't approve of what she wanted to do with the row. Hand. Celeste rubbed her thumb against the edge of her coffee cup, and I think Maris made commitments before she understood how serious he was about stopping it. I looked at the stewardship form again. 10 years. No sale. No redevelopment that changed residential use. Suddenly those restrictions didn't look like Dad being sentimental. They looked defensive. Commitments to whom? You'll have to ask her. You've spent 2 days telling me not to assume the worst about Maris. Now you're telling me she was trying to develop property she didn't own. I'm telling you something more complicated than that. Celeste met my eyes. Maris believed she eventually would own it. I looked toward the ivory envelope lying open on the table. Because Dad told her she'd inherit it. Because for years, your father let her believe she'd be the one handling everything. There it was again, not theft, not a forged will, an expectation. One Dad himself had apparently helped create. So what changed? I asked. Celeste shook her head. I know they had a serious argument. I know the transfer happened afterward. And I know Maris had already been talking to other people as if Whitmore Row would be available. Available for what? Celeste hesitated. Redevelopment. I thought about the houses I'd walked past, the repaired porches, the original windows, Dad's handwritten notes about tenants he didn't want displaced. Then I thought about Maris warning me not to sign anything before she'd even known what I'd found. I gathered the election documents and slid them back into the ivory envelope. Are you going to sign? Celeste asked. Not yet. Why not? Because Dad doesn't get to make this decision for me just because he's dead. And neither does Maris. I took the envelope with me when I left. For the first time since the will reading, I wasn't trying to figure out which daughter Dad had valued more. I was trying to understand what accepting his offer would actually mean, and why my sister seemed willing to do almost anything to make sure I refused it. As I reached the door, Celeste spoke behind me. Elara. I turned. She looked uncomfortable. There's one thing I should have told you sooner. I waited. Maris doesn't need Whitmore Row to keep what your father left her. I know. Celeste shook her head. That's not what I mean. She needs it because she's already promised it to someone else. Before I asked Maris who she'd promised Whitmore Row to, I needed to decide whether I cared enough about the place to do anything with the answer. So the next morning, instead of calling her, I went back to the row and asked Nora to show me what 10 years of stewardship would actually look like. She started with a roof estimate for house number 4. Then she showed me a plumbing problem at number 11, a porch foundation that needed attention at number 8, and a reserve account that was healthy but nowhere near large enough to make those problems disappear. Still look like a secret inheritance? Nora asked. At the moment it looks like Dad left me a very organized collection of future invoices. That got a laugh out of her. We walked the block together. I met Mrs. Alvarez at number 11, whose name I'd seen on Dad's card. She was watering 2 tomato plants on her back steps and told me she'd been there 15 years. She didn't know anything about the will or the envelope. She only knew my father had promised that if she kept taking care of the house, nobody would suddenly double her rent because the neighborhood got more expensive. At number 3, a single mother named Keisha showed me the bedroom window Dad had agreed to replace before winter. None of these conversations were dramatic. That was exactly why they mattered. These people weren't pieces in whatever argument Dad and Maris had been having. They had jobs, budgets, children, retirement plans. If I signed the stewardship election just because I was angry at my sister, they would still be there after my anger wore off. By noon, I'd made one decision. I wasn't signing anything until I could honestly say I was willing to do the work. Nora and I were back in the office when my phone buzzed. Maris. It was her 4th call that morning. This time I answered. Can we meet? She asked. Are you going to tell me what you promised? There was a pause. I want to discuss an alternative. That word was enough to get me there. We met at a quiet cafe 20 minutes from Whitmore Row. Maris had already ordered coffee and placed a slim folder beside her cup. She pushed it toward me before I'd even taken off my coat. Read it before you say no? No to what? $250,000. I sat down. For what? For you to walk away from this. I opened the folder. The first page described the payment as coming from Maris personally, not Dad's estate. In exchange, I would release any right to accept the stewardship position. You're offering me $250,000 not to take a job that barely pays anything. I'm offering you actual money instead of 10 years managing Dad's sentimental housing project. Nora manages the properties. You know what I mean. I kept reading. Maris watched me closely. On the 4th page, I found the part she hadn't mentioned. The agreement didn't simply record my refusal to become steward. It authorized termination of the pending election and consented to dissolution of the stewardship entity. Once that happened, the properties could be transferred. This doesn't just remove me, I said. It removes the structure. Because the structure isn't practical. Practical for whom? For anyone. Look at those houses. You've seen the maintenance costs. I have. Then you know Dad was locking millions of dollars into properties that barely perform. Her voice stayed calm. That almost made the conversation harder. Maris wasn't pretending the residents didn't exist. She simply viewed the situation through numbers. You could take $250,000 today. She continued, no tenants calling you, no roofs, no 10-year restriction. You go back to your life. I deal with the rest. What happens to the houses? They get used properly? That's not an answer. The land is worth considerably more than the current rental income justifies. There it was. Not cruelty, arithmetic. And the people living there? Any redevelopment would have relocation provisions. So there is a redevelopment. Maris looked down at her coffee. There are options. Celeste said you already promised Whitmore Row to someone. Her eyes lifted immediately. Celeste shouldn't have said that. Is it true? It's more complicated. Everything in this family becomes complicated right before somebody has to answer a direct question. She leaned back. You weren't here, Elara. I knew where this was going before she continued. For 9 years, I handled Dad's life whenever it became inconvenient. His bills, his taxes, his appointments, property calls at midnight. You came for holidays when you could manage it. Argued with him about preservation, then drove home. I let the words sit between us, because enough of them were true that defending myself would only make the conversation easier for her. You did more for him than I did, I said. Maris seemed surprised. I'm not disputing that. Then why are you acting like I stole something? I'm not. I tapped the folder. You're the one offering me $250,000 to sign away something you keep saying doesn't matter. Her face tightened. Dad told me for years I'd handle the properties someday. And you assumed that meant every property. What was I supposed to assume? Maybe that they weren't yours until they were actually yours. That landed. She looked toward the window. I went back through the agreement and noticed a date in the execution section. It wasn't just soon. It was tomorrow. Why does this need to be signed by 10 tomorrow morning? Administrative timing. Maris. There are agreements connected to the property. With who? Business partners. What did you promise them? I didn't promise them 17 houses. The wording was too careful. What did you promise them? She didn't answer. I closed the folder and slid it across the table. I'm not signing this. Her hand stopped on top of it. Don't make this emotional. I'm the only person at this table who hasn't made a decision yet. You have no idea what you're taking on. That's why I haven't signed Dad's form either. That surprised her more than my refusal. You haven't. No. For the first time since the will reading, I saw some of the pressure leave her face. Only some. Then wait. she said. Give me until tomorrow. Why? Because once you activate that structure, certain things can't be undone. That's what Dad intended. Dad changed his mind in the middle of something he didn't understand. Then explain what he didn't understand. She gathered the folder, but her hands weren't quite steady. I can't do this here. You chose here. She stood. I need to make some calls. I stayed seated. Maris, she looked down at me. Who are you supposed to deliver those 17 houses to? For a second, neither of us spoke. She didn't answer the question, but she didn't deny it either. Outside, I followed her into the parking lot. What happens at 10 tomorrow? I asked. She opened her car door. A deadline. For what? For a partnership I entered before Dad died. That was the first time she'd admitted it plainly. How much are you in for? Her expression hardened again. You don't understand what I stand to lose. Then tell me. She got into the car. Just don't sign anything tonight. I watched her pull away with Dad's stewardship form still in my bag and Maris's unsigned $250,000 offer fresh in my mind, 24 hours earlier. I'd thought the question was whether I wanted what Dad had left me. Now, I understood there was another question underneath it. My sister had already risked something substantial on the assumption that Whitmore Row would become hers. And by 10 the next morning, one of us was going to have to live with the fact that it hadn't. I could have called Maris again and demanded the rest of the story, but by then I'd learned that asking my family a direct question usually got me the version of the truth that was most convenient for whoever answered. So I went back to Whitmore Row. Nora was still in the office when I arrived, and when I asked whether she'd ever seen paperwork connected to redevelopment, she didn't have to think long. There was a survey packet, she said, last year. It came here by mistake. What kind of survey? Boundary measurements, utility access, demolition estimates. Your father's name wasn't on the cover. Maris's was. Nora found an old project folder and pulled out a photocopy she'd kept because the survey involved tenant access. The proposal wasn't difficult to understand. Most of the 17 houses would be removed. The individual lots would be combined, and the block would be redeveloped into denser, higher rent housing. On paper, it probably looked efficient. The land was worth far more than the income Dad was collecting from it. I scanned the partnership page and found Maris's name beside the words future contributing partner. She wasn't representing herself as the owner, I said. Not exactly, Nora replied. But everybody involved seemed to believe the land would become available. Did Dad know? It did after this arrived. What happened? Nora closed the folder. They had one of the worst arguments I ever heard between them, not because they were shouting. Your father barely raised his voice. He kept asking Maris when he'd agreed to sell. She kept saying she was planning ahead. 11 weeks before Dad died, Whitmore Row had been moved into the stewardship entity. The timing no longer looked mysterious. Dad hadn't randomly reorganized his assets at the end of his life. Something had triggered it. I called Maris and told her I wanted to meet at Dad's house. She corrected me automatically. My house now? Fine. Your house. 8 o'clock. When I arrived, she was sitting at the kitchen island with a stack of papers in front of her. That kitchen had barely changed since we were teenagers. Same oak cabinets, same brass handles. Dad's coffee mug was still beside the machine. Maris noticed me looking at it and moved the mug into a cabinet. You talk to Nora, she said. I saw the redevelopment survey. Then you know there was a legitimate project. I know you were listed as a future contributing partner before you owned the land. She rubbed her forehead. I wasn't trying to steal Dad's property. I didn't say you were. You're thinking it. Actually, I'm trying very hard not to decide what I'm thinking until you tell me what happened. That seemed to take some of the fight out of her. She pulled out the chair across from her. Dad had been telling me for years that I'd handle the property someday. Celeste told me. Did she tell you what handling them looked like? I sat down. Maris didn't wait for an answer. When Dad stopped driving at night, I drove him. When he started missing tax deadlines, I fixed them. When one of his commercial tenants called at 1 a.m. because a pipe burst, they called me after they couldn't reach him. I passed on a job in Chicago because he said he needed me here. I hadn't known about Chicago. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have moved back? I didn't answer. That's what I thought. There was no cruelty in it. Just an old resentment that had probably been waiting years for a sentence short enough to carry it. You did more for Dad than I did, I said. I told you that yesterday. And somehow I'm still the greedy sister, because I believed him when he said I'd take over. Believing you'd take over isn't the problem. I placed the survey copy between us. Committing property before it belonged to you is. She stared at the page. The row was losing potential value every year. Dad knew that. Maybe he didn't measure its value the same way you did. That's easy for you to say. You weren't the one reviewing his accounts. Then tell me what you committed. Maris pushed her chair back and walked to the window. I put money into the partnership. How much? Silence. Maris. $180,000. I actually thought I'd misheard her. Your money? Yes. Before Dad died. 6 months before. That explained the $250,000 offer. It wasn't generosity. It was the price Maris had calculated for getting herself out of a much larger problem. What did the partnership think your $180,000 was buying? I asked. Hurley, stage costs, planning, design work, deposits. The other partners were bringing capital once the land became available. Land you didn't own. She turned around. Land I had every reason to believe would come under my control. Except Dad was still alive. And he had spent years telling me I'd run the company. The company. Not necessarily Whitmore Row. There was no separate Whitmore Row then. That stopped me. She was right about that part. The stewardship entity hadn't existed when she'd entered the partnership. Dad had created it afterward. When did he find out about your deal? I asked. After the survey went to Nora? And that's when you argued? Yes. What did he say? Maris looked tired now rather than defensive. He said I'd confused being trusted with being entitled. The sentence sounded exactly like Dad. I told him he was throwing away money to keep 17 families in houses that could be replaced with 3 times as many units. He said I'd missed the point. What point? Had didn't explain it to me either. She gave a short laugh. Apparently mysterious instructions weren't something he reserved for you. For the first time, I could see the shape of what had happened without needing either sister to be entirely right. Maris had spent years doing the work Dad increasingly depended on her to do. Dad had allowed that dependence to become an expectation. Maris had then taken that expectation one step further and treated future control as if it already existed. When Dad discovered it, he pulled Whitmore Row out of the company she was expected to inherit. Did you know about the stewardship before he died? I asked. I knew he was moving the row. I didn't know the final terms. Did you try to stop him? I argued with him. That's not what I asked. Her eyes narrowed. No. Elara. I didn't forge his signature. I didn't change his will. I didn't hide documents from him. If that's where you're going, then why hide them from me? That landed harder. She looked away. Because after he died, I knew there was an election period. And if you never activated the stewardship, there was a possibility the structure could be dissolved before a successor took control. So you tried to get me to sign a release before I knew what I was releasing. Was trying to preserve a project that already had money in it. Your project, my money, and 16 occupied houses, 17 properties, she corrected automatically, or 1 is vacant. Even now, she knew the portfolio better than I did. That made the whole thing sadder somehow. You could have told me, I said. At the will reading, you could have said, Dad changed something. I made a financial commitment, and I need you to understand what happens next. and you would have listened. I don't know. But you didn't give me the chance. She sat down again. I thought if you saw $250,000, you'd take it. Because you think I don't care about Whitmore Row. You didn't know it existed 4 days ago. That's not the same thing. Who'sn't it? I didn't have an easy answer. That was what made Maris difficult to dismiss. Some of what she said was true. I hadn't known those residents. I hadn't spent years dealing with Dad's properties. And accepting stewardship now wouldn't magically erase the fact that Maris had carried responsibilities I hadn't. But none of that gave her the right to decide my choice before I understood it. Did Dad create the stewardship to punish you? I asked. Maris looked toward the cabinet where she'd put his mug. That's what it felt like. That isn't an answer. It's the only one I have. My phone showed 9:17 p.m., less than 13 hours remained before her deadline. I put the survey back into my bag and stood. What are you going to do? She asked. Read the letters? Tonight. All of them. She followed me into the hallway. Elara. I turned. The anger had gone out of her face. Please don't sign it tonight. It was the first time she'd asked instead of instructed. Why? Because at 10 tomorrow, if the row can't be contributed, I lose part of the money I've already put in, and I'm responsible for unwinding the rest. How much of it can you lose? Enough. I waited, but she didn't give me another number. I opened the front door. I won't sign because I want you to lose money, I said. But I won't refuse because you want me to save it either. I drove back toward Whitmore Row with the ivory envelope on the passenger seat. For days, I'd been trying to determine whether Maris had stolen something Dad meant for me. Now I knew she hadn't. She'd done something messier. She'd built a future around a promise Dad had never actually made, then tried to make my decision for me when that future began collapsing. But one question still bothered me more than the money. Dad could have protected Whitmore Row in dozens of ways. He could have put Nora in charge. He could have transferred it directly to a housing organization. Instead, he'd written my initials beside one word choose. Before morning, I needed to understand why. I reached Whitmore Row a little before 11 that night. Nora had left me a key to the office, so I let myself in, turned on the desk lamp, and placed the ivory envelope in front of me. I could have skipped straight to the 17th letter. By then I was almost certain it was meant for me, but that felt like repeating the same mistake Maris had made, deciding what mattered based on how it affected me. So I started with house number 1. The letters weren't emotional farewells. Dad hadn't suddenly become sentimental on paper. They were instructions mixed with promises. At number 3, he confirmed the porch repair he'd approved and wrote that the work should be completed even if ownership changed. At number 7, he documented a rent arrangement for a retired mechanic who had helped maintain several properties. At number 11, he wrote that Mrs. Alvarez could remain as long as she wanted the house, and continued honoring the lease. Other letters dealt with repairs, rent limits, and commitments he'd apparently made in conversations nobody else had recorded. By the 6th letter, I understood why he'd created the stewardship structure. It wasn't really about preserving 17 old houses. It was about preventing whoever came after him from treating 17 existing promises as inconveniences. By the 12th, I also understood why Maris had hated the idea. Some of those promises made terrible financial sense if your only question was how much the land could earn. I finished the 16th letter at 1:08 a.m. One envelope remained. It didn't have a street number on the front. It had my name, Elara Whitmore. I sat there for almost a minute before opening it. Dad's letter was only 3 pages long. The first paragraph annoyed me immediately because it sounded so much like him. He wrote that if I was reading it, I had found Whitmore Row without being handed the answer, which meant I had cared enough to ask why it existed. I almost stopped there. Even dead, he had found a way to make curiosity feel like an exam. But the next paragraph was different. He admitted he'd made mistakes with both of us. For years, he'd relied on Maris because she stayed nearby, knew the business, and could make decisions quickly. Over time, he'd started assuming that because she could handle something, she should eventually control it. Maris had started making the same assumption. He didn't blame her alone for that. Then he wrote about me. He said he'd mistaken distance for indifference. When I chose preservation work instead of joining Whitmore Property Group, he'd treated it as rejection. He'd spent years making jokes about my career because it was easier than admitting he didn't understand why I wanted to save things that couldn't produce the highest return. Then Whitmore Row had forced him to think differently. I looked around Nora's little office as I read. Dad wrote that he'd originally bought the houses as ordinary rentals. Over the years, that changed. Tenants stayed. He made promises. People built their lives there, without planning to. He'd created something he no longer believed should be judged solely by its resale value. Then Maris brought him the redevelopment plan. He understood her logic. That was one line I read twice. He didn't call her greedy. He didn't accuse her of betraying him. He wrote that if he had been 20 years younger, he might have made the same proposal himself. What frightened him was realizing he'd spent years teaching Maris to measure good stewardship by growth, while privately making exceptions to that rule whenever Whitmore Row was involved. He had given her one set of expectations and then blamed her for following them too far. The stewardship structure was his attempt to correct that, not by taking the company away from Maris, but by removing these 17 houses from a system where maximum return would eventually win every argument. Then came the sentence I'd been waiting days to understand. I thought of you because you have spent your adult life arguing that value and price are not always the same thing. I put the letter down. For years, Dad and I had fought over exactly that. He'd called preservation inefficient. I'd accused him of reducing everything to a spreadsheet. Neither of us had ever admitted the other might have a point. Now, after he was gone, I was sitting inside proof that he'd been listening. It didn't erase the will. It didn't erase years of being dismissed, but it changed the meaning of them enough that I had to sit with it. I kept reading. Dad wrote that he didn't know whether I would want Whitmore Row. More importantly, he didn't believe I owed it to him. That was why he hadn't named me directly as permanent steward. I had first choice, nothing more. If I declined, control would pass to a non-profit housing organization he'd already selected. The operating restrictions would remain. The residents would remain protected. Whitmore Row would not revert to Maris or the company. I stopped. Then I read that section of the stewardship documents again. There it was in language I'd skimmed past because I'd been so focused on my own election. Successor Steward Harbour Community Housing Trust. Dad had built a backup into the structure. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. For the first time since Maris had asked about the envelope, I understood something neither of us had understood at the beginning. I didn't have to accept Whitmore Row to keep Maris from redeveloping it. I could walk away. Dad's backup would step in, and Maris's partnership would still lose access to the land. That changed everything. If I signed now, I couldn't tell myself I was protecting the houses because nobody else would. I couldn't tell myself I had to accept because Dad needed me. And I definitely couldn't tell myself I was doing it because Maris deserved to lose. The decision was finally what Dad's note had said from the beginning. A choice. I walked outside and stood in front of house 17. Unlike the others, it was empty. Nora had told me Dad kept it that way for storage and occasional community meetings. The porch light was off, but I could see the outline of the repaired windows and the shallow roof over the front steps. I tried to picture 10 years of budgets, maintenance calls, arguments over rent increases, contractors, inspections, and residents who would sometimes disagree with me. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it wasn't completely separate from that life either. My work already involved preserving buildings without freezing them in time. Whitmore Row needed exactly that kind of balance. At 6:30, Nora arrived and found me back in the office with coffee and the stewardship documents spread across her desk. "You've been here all night?" "Pretty much." She looked at the papers. Did you decide? I have one question. If I accept, does the steward have to personally manage day-to-day operations? No. That's what I'm for, assuming you don't fire me. I'm considering it. Your coffee is terrible, she smiled. Then I should start packing. I turned the document toward her. I can keep my consulting work. Of course. The steward sets policy and approves major decisions. Professional management is already permitted. That mattered. Accepting didn't require me to abandon the life I'd built just to prove something to Dad after his death. I picked up the pen. Before signing, I called Maris. She answered on the second ring. Elara. I read everything. Silence. And? Dad named a backup steward. Another silence, longer this time. What? If I decline, Harbour Community Housing Trust takes over. The restrictions stay. That's not what I was told. It's in the documents. I could hear her breathing on the other end. So you're saying it doesn't matter what you do? It matters to me? Hear you signing? I looked at Dad's 17th letter beside my hand. Yes. Why? There was no anger in her voice. That made it easier to answer. Because I want to see if this can work. You're going to cost me a lot of money. I know. And that doesn't bother you? It does. But losing your money isn't why I'm doing it. She didn't respond. Maris, the row was already unavailable to your partnership whether I signed or not. Dad made that decision before either of us understood it. He made it because of me. Partly. He also made it because he realized he'd promised things to people he didn't want either of us undoing. So that's it? For the row, yes. I ended the call, signed my name, and dated the election. Nora witnessed it and submitted the activation paperwork electronically. At 9:42, 18 minutes before Maris's deadline, confirmation came back, stewardship activated. Whitmore Row could not be dissolved under the release Maris had brought me. I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I mostly felt tired. At 9:47, my phone lit up with a message from Maris. 5 words. The partnership has been notified. I looked through the office window at the 17 houses Dad had spent years quietly protecting. My sister had inherited almost everything named in his will. I hadn't changed that. I wasn't going to challenge it. But for the first time, I also understood that the envelope had never been Dad's secret attempt to make the inheritance equal. He had been trying, clumsily and far too late, to separate two things our family had spent years treating as identical, owning something and being trusted with it. Now the financial argument was over. What remained was harder. Maris, and I still had to decide what we were to each other, when neither of us could use Dad's approval as the prize anymore. Maris did lose money, but she didn't lose everything. That distinction mattered to me. 3 weeks after I signed the stewardship election, her redevelopment partnership formally removed Whitmore Row from the project. Some early expenses were unrecoverable, and Maris lost a substantial portion of the 180,000 she'd already put in. The rest had to be negotiated between her and the other partners. I never asked for the final number. I didn't need it. She still owned Dad's house. She still had his investments. She still controlled Whitmore Property Group. I didn't challenge the will, demand a larger share, or try to turn her failed deal into proof that I'd somehow won. The consequence was simple. Maris had committed money based on property she expected to control, and when that assumption turned out to be wrong, she had to absorb the cost. Aunt Celeste came to see me during that 3rd week. We sat in the Whitmore Row office while Nora was out meeting a contractor. Celeste apologized, although not in the sweeping way people sometimes apologize when what they really want is immediate forgiveness. I should have told you more, she said. I thought keeping your father's instructions exactly as he gave them was the same thing as respecting him. It wasn't. I know that now. I appreciated that she didn't add an excuse. I told her I understood why she'd kept the envelope, but I also told her I wasn't going to pretend Dad's elaborate system of clues had been a good way to handle his daughters. He could have talked to us while he was alive. He could have been clearer with Maris years earlier about what handling things someday actually meant. He could have told me he'd stopped dismissing my work instead of leaving me 3 pages to discover after his death. Celeste nodded. Your father was better at correcting paperwork than conversations. That was probably the most accurate thing anyone said about him during those weeks. Maris didn't contact me until almost a month after the partnership fell apart. Her message contained no apology. It simply asked whether I could meet her at House 17, because Dad still had several boxes stored there that technically belonged with the personal property she'd inherited. I agreed. She was already inside when I arrived. The house was mostly empty except for folding chairs, 2 metal shelves, and several boxes marked with Dad's handwriting. Maris had one open on the floor. These are company records, she said. Take them. I will. She closed the box and remained crouched beside it for a moment before standing. I lost $72,000. I hadn't asked. I'm sorry. She gave me a skeptical look. Are you? I didn't want you to lose $72,000. But you signed anyway. Those aren't contradictory. She leaned against the wall. You sound like Dad. Please don't ruin my morning. That almost made her smile. Almost. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then Maris looked around the empty room. I really did think this would be mine. I know. Not because I sat around waiting for Dad to die. I know that too. She folded her arms. Every year, there was more. More bills. More things he didn't want to deal with. And every time I handled one, he'd say something like, "This is why you'll be the one running things someday." After a while, I stopped hearing that as gratitude. You heard it as a promise. Yes, she looked at me. And then you'd show up twice a year, argue with him for 3 hours, leave again, and somehow you were still the person whose opinion bothered him enough to remember. That was the first time she'd said what I suspected had been underneath her anger all along. You thought I got to leave without paying for it, didn't you? No, I didn't say it angrily. I just paid differently. Maris looked away. When I saw the stewardship paperwork, I thought he was punishing me. Maybe part of him was angry. And part of him suddenly decided you understood something I didn't. According to his letter, he also thought he helped create the problem. She looked back at me. He wrote that? Yes. I told her the part that mattered. Dad knew he'd taught her to equate good management with growth, then expected her to somehow recognize that Whitmore Row was the exception. Maris sat down on one of the folding chairs. For the first time since this started, she didn't look like my older sister who always knew what came next. She just looked tired. He could have told me that. He could have told both of us a lot of things. We sat with that for a while. There was no dramatic apology after it. Maris didn't suddenly say she'd been wrong about everything. I didn't forgive every choice she'd made. She had still tried to get my signature without explaining what it would do. She had still offered me money to make a decision that protected her investment rather than giving me the truth. Understanding why she'd done those things didn't make them acceptable. Eventually she asked, "Do you think Dad loved you more in the end?" The question surprised me. A month earlier, I might have wanted the answer to be yes. After seeing the will, some embarrassed part of me had wanted proof that Dad had secretly changed his mind and chosen me instead. But the 17 letters had made that idea feel smaller than it once had. "No," I said. Maris studied me. "You don't? I don't think the company means he loved you more. And I don't think Whitmore Row means he loved me more. Then what does it mean? That he trusted us with different things and did a terrible job explaining why." She looked down at her hands. "That's not very satisfying. It's more satisfying than spending the next 20 years comparing account balances." I stood and picked up one of Dad's boxes. Before leaving, I made one thing clear. Whitmore Row wasn't available for any future project involving Maris or Whitmore Property Group. If she wanted to advise me on an operational issue, I'd listen. But ownership, family history, And the size of her inheritance would never give her authority over the row. She nodded. Fair enough. That wasn't reconciliation. We didn't start calling each other every Sunday. But it was the first conversation we'd had in years where neither of us was trying to prove which daughter had mattered more. 6 months later, House 17 looked completely different. We hadn't turned it into another rental. After reviewing the operating rules, Nora and I converted part of it into a small management office and meeting room for residents. My preservation consulting work continued. Nora kept handling day-to-day operations. I handled major decisions, long-term repairs, and the occasional problem neither of us had predicted. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Nora dropped a contractor's estimate onto my desk. "Number 4, she said, "roof." I looked at the total and groaned. You know, when people hear family inheritance, nobody mentions gutters. Would you prefer 17 luxury cars? At least I could sell those. Nora laughed and went back to her desk. I looked through the window at the row. Mrs. Alvarez was carrying groceries up her steps. A contractor was measuring the porch at number 8. Nothing about the scene looked like revenge. That was probably why I was finally comfortable with it. Maris had inherited most of Dad's wealth. I had been offered responsibility for something he'd decided shouldn't be measured only by wealth. Neither of those things erased the mistakes he'd made with us. Neither proved which daughter he'd loved more. The missing envelope had mattered because it contained the one thing neither Maris nor I had understood when the will was read. Dad wasn't secretly trying to make the inheritance equal. He was separating ownership from stewardship and leaving me free to decide whether I wanted the second one. I used to think the strangest part was that Maris inherited almost everything and still couldn't stop asking about one envelope. Now I understood why. She wasn't afraid of what Dad had given me. She was afraid of what he'd finally stopped assuming would belong to her. And maybe that's the part families get wrong most often. When someone says something will be yours someday, at what point do you start treating that expectation like something you already own?